Okay, so just some quick things about myself. Here's my wonderful family. They're sitting in the front. As you kind of heard in the background, right? Researcher, teaching at Vanguard, right? That's been, the thing that I've been kind of doing now. But, the one thing that always kind of remains in my heart is that I'm a teacher at heart. I've taught for 10 years in a public school for 10 years. Taught in California, taught in different schools, Riverside to Irvine. So everything I do as a professor, as I'm working with my students, right, all comes from the lens of being a teacher, right? And it's really cool because I don't work with credential students. I'm kind of working with them at the undergraduate level. And so when you think about the whole like becoming a teacher, right? You guys went through undergrad, you went to credential, right? And you had to kind of worry about the TPA and getting all those credential requirements. But for me, right, it's kind of the fun time where I get to work with the college students who are still kind of on the fence, right? Do I want to become a teacher? Is this for me, right? Do I have what it takes to be a teacher, right? And so for me, it's really important for me to kind of guide them through this whole process, right? To kind of let them know the realities of schools, because I think for the most part, we have this, kind of idealized version of school being a perfect world, right? And I try to tell students, right, that, it's not to say that it's like flaws and it's chaotic, right? But it's different, right? The schools that you grew up in, the schools that we see, right, it's very different, right? So I really try hard to prepare them. And so that's why this topic about trauma responsive practice is very important to me, why we talk about SEL, because academics is like, seems to be like the priority, right? But, we need to focus on self-care and how do we become more compassionate, right? Empathetic towards our students, right? Those seems to matter the most. And so just a kind of quick background, when I think about education, right, I kind of think of it in very broad terms, where it's not just focused on boom, 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 Common Core, academics, right? There's a lot of priority, there's all these needs, right, that need to be met right before we get there. As chair of liberal studies, and something that, if you're interested about our education program, right, I really try to find ways for our programs to be accessible. I know there's a big teacher shortage out there. There's a lot of schools that are in need of teachers, right? And so at least at Vanguard, right, we are a Hispanic serving institution. We were 46% Hispanic, right? Students from first generation background, low income background, right? And so we try to make our program very accessible, right? We know that the students that we're working with are very diverse, right? And so, our schools and our teachers, right, should, do the best to kind of reflect our realities of our students. So we offer different ITEP programs, accelerated programs. What that means is that in your days, probably, as when you go into the pathway of becoming a teacher, right? 4 years of undergrad, then you get a credential, right? But we're trying to find ways to provide more accelerated, more accessible pathways so now our students can do what's called a ITEP program. Have you heard of the ITEP program? It's sort of a combined hybrid, get your bachelor's teaching credential at the same time. And so we're even trying to find faster ways, right, from getting students into the classroom. Okay, so that's a little background of myself, and just to kind of let you know, as someone who's taught in the classroom, right, this is really important work for me, right? And I can kind of spend time to do some research, right? I know for all of us, we're very busy, kind of hustling, bustling in the classrooms, in the office, and trying to do great things. But in this time, right, I've been to kind of really be able to kind of absorb and kind of like soak in a lot of this research that I'm going to kind of share with you. Okay, so before I talk about trauma, I just want to do a little kind of demonstration, like kind of set the scene, right? So I'm going to have my my little A-list actor to come here and do this. All right, so imagine it's a Tuesday afternoon, right? And it's like after recess, right? The kids went to lunch, right? And then we're going to try to try to engage. You have some math lessons, right? So, all right, kids, it's circle time. Let's get back into the carpet. Let's get back to the circle. No. Olivia, do you want to come to the circle? Everybody's here. Let's go, guys. We're going to have a lot of activities planned. You want to come to the circle? No. Oh, wait. I have your favorite game. Do you want to come over to the carpet? I got your favorite game. No. Olivia, what's wrong? How come you don't want to come to the carpet? I don't know. Okay. So we all seen this before, right? This example where it's sort of a back and forth, right? And so it's like kind of pulling teeth, right? And how do we get our kids to kind of like listen to us, and we start to get frustrated, right? And so think about this simple example, right? It doesn't seem that big, but when you think about as a teacher, right? You came in, you spent like 5 or 6 hours the night before, right? You have this awesome lesson, right? you develop this really cool lesson plan, right? And this incident sort of happens, right? And so this may take, 1, 2, 3 minutes of back and forth, right? You start to get frustrated, right? And it's like, oh my gosh, like I had this whole schedule plan, right? And now it's kind of disrupted, right? All the kids are starting to start to get up, and they start to get kind of rattled, right? What's going on, Mr. Teacher, right? And so they get kind of rattled, right? So let me kind of show you just a little bit of what we can do here, right? So, hey Olivia, if you come to our little place, right? You have a choice, right? You can play with us, or you can hang out with your friends. Does that sound good?
Okay.
Yeah. Are you feeling okay? Give me a thumbs up, thumbs down. Cool. Okay. So now she's like back on track, right? She's back. Sit down there. Yay.
Yeah.
So I'll say again, we see those behaviors, right? It could be very kind of disruptive, right? And so I think as teachers, right, we have sort of our plan, right? And so when something gets disruptive, right, it kind of throws everything off, right? And so in that instance, right, we're going to talk a lot about behaviors in the classroom, right? I know in the education world, right, we've sort of learned about things like, stimulus response, right, rewards and consequences, right, good behavior versus bad behavior, right? We sort of kind of focus on that, right? And so, what I'm kind of going to share, right, is going to be something that where we can really kind of learn about kind of the roots of behaviors. I mean, just kind of learning about how, as teachers, right, we really have this, we're very trained to kind of view behaviors, right, good kid versus bad kid, right, and kind of focus on that, right? And so kind of things I've been kind of looking at are from a very clinical psychologist kind of perspective, right? And so the unfortunate realities in schools, right, is as teachers, right, we've just sort of been trained to sort of assume that behavior is very linear, right? You do this and this happens, right? If you don't do this, right, this doesn't happen, right? Versus if we kind of look at a child from a deep down psychological perspective, right, then that'll help us to better understand our children's experiences, right? Versus kind of focusing on the behavior, right? And so, that's sort of the framework of what we're going to go through. And so as we kind of learn about trauma, again, in no shape or form am I able to kind of capture everything about trauma, but I want to just give you at least some, major insights, some takeaways, right? I do recommend these really good books. A lot of what I'm drawing from is from this clinical psychologist. Her name is Dr. Della Hook. She's LA-based, right? She works with child psychology, right? And she has these really great books where, there's a mix of very strong kind of research if you're like really interested in that stuff, but a lot of very, very practical things, right? And so she's worked, 30 years in this field, just podcasts and media, right? And so when I found her book, it just like, spoke to me, right? Because she was really speaking about something that, as someone who's been an educator, right, I've seen a lot of, people, a lot of different professional developments, workshop that sort of kind of went over my head. There's a lot of, jargon, a lot of psychobabble, right? But for her, like, she really kind of breaks it down just in a way that was very kind of, comprehensive to me, right? So I do recommend her. She has a lot of podcasts, and as a clinical psychologist, I mean, her work really is serving teachers, right? Serving educators, right? Trying to bring that work to educators, because like I said earlier, how it can be very frustrating when we're in education, but we just have sort of this kind of very narrow narrow focus on a behavior when we look at more of the bigger picture. So really recommend her work. Okay, so here's some of the key objectives, right? We'll talk about trauma and its characteristics, the impact that it has on the brain, and just some long-term physical impacts. And I do want to just kind of lead into the topic about teachers and self-care. I understand trauma is vicarious, meaning that it gets passed on, right? So I don't want to leave that, because we don't want to, trauma doesn't operate in a vacuum, right? It does have, domino effects that also affect teachers, right? And as you know, so you guys are in the field, in the classroom, right? And you kind of feel it from the students. So, just a quick, kind of more of a textbook definition. When we think about stress as an event or series of event or set of circumstances experienced by an individual, physically or emotionally harmful, right? And so when we think about trauma, right, I mean, there's different levels of trauma, right? How many of you experienced trauma before? So, and so, and I think most of you, kind of remember there is some kind of set of trauma, right? And so we think about trauma, right? I think we kind of hear a lot, but what do we mean by trauma, right? And so I think we kind of break down trauma by kind of 3 different levels, right? So number one, acute trauma, right? We're talking about just sort of isolated incident of trauma, right? And there's like, and the next one, right, is complex trauma, right? This is trauma that is accumulation. It's multiple trauma happening at once, right? And then last, there's like historical and cultural trauma, right? And so for the first one, right, when I talk about acute trauma, right, we think about, in most trauma, we think about trauma, right? Doesn't, we like to think that most trauma is more acute, where it's a one and done, happens and it's all gone, right? Maybe a kid breaks their arm, right? And then suddenly they're out for the rest of the day, right? That could be a result of acute trauma, right? But most trauma, right, majority of trauma, right, is what we call complex trauma, right? I remember when I was a kid and I had trauma, right, so just kind of give you a quick kind of personal story, right? So I was in high school, right? My dad passed away, so it was very unfortunate because he passed away so young, right, at 50, right? So that time, right, was very, very traumatic, right? And it sort of like set me, in a low kind of depressive mood, right? But not only that, right? For me, right, because my dad passed away, right, I was struggling, right? I was depressed, right? And so what did I turn to, right? I had very poor, coping mechanisms, right? Turn to food, right? I started to overeat, right? Go for sugary snacks, right? And so I became very overweight, right? And so I remember at school, right? When I went to school, right? Kids bullied me because I was overweight, right? And so you can kind of see just how that trauma sort of started to kind of snowball, right? Into one thing after the other, right? And so think about trauma, right? It's not just, it just happens once and it's gone, right? You can imagine how, even the homes, right? Kids are in single family homes, or there's violence in the home, right? Something happens between mom and dad, or I don't love you anymore, or, you have to, the kid has to sleep on the street, right? It's not just like that it happens and it's gone, right? They come to school, kids start to notice, or the teacher starts to notice something and the kid acts up. Oh my gosh, you're, not doing the right thing, right? So it kind of snowballs, right? So when we think about trauma, again, not to kind of think about it as sort of an isolated, just happens once, right? It's a complex, it's a series, right? It snowballs, right? It accumulates, right? And so not to mention in schools where it could also be a place where that trauma starts to manifest and starts to multiply, right? So that could be very kind of traumatic for the student, right? So just thinking about trauma in kind of more broader terms, right? And there you go. So I'll just kind of share this quickly and just kind of very briefly, right? So as I kind of mentioned, everybody for the most part has experienced trauma, right? And we're talking about here in our adulthoods, right? We're adults, right? So there's been many kind of moments in our time, right? But unfortunately, right, that trauma happens at a much earlier age, right? Earlier than what we like to kind of want it, right? So 2 out of 3 children are starting to experience trauma, right? We're talking about, from 5 to 7, so already kids have experienced trauma. And, we can kind of imagine all the different reasons, right? As I kind of mentioned, divorce rates are, 50%, more and more people are out of jobs, right? So just things that happen to family, just social circumstances, right? Those are naturally, right, has been kind of the drivers to why kids are also experiencing trauma. When there's a major move, right, a family has to move from a different city, dad loses their job, they have to move to a different place, or they have to adjust the living situation, right? So a lot of that, disruption, right, a lot of that unstableness, right, we can imagine are kind of driving that trauma. And when people think about trauma, right, on the surface, right, we sort of assume that it must be some, sexual abuse or child abuse, or it's something person to person, right, when it is kind of the product of our environment. Unfortunately, just some more statistics. I hope not to like keep hammering this, but suicide ideation is on the rise, right, and now it's kind of happening at a much earlier age. So that's pretty unfortunate. And and teachers also face vicarious trauma, right? I'm always interested in kind of learning about first-year teachers who burn out very fast, right? There's such a high teacher turnover, right? And so we think about trauma, right? Again, it's not just within the child and within their ecosystem, right? It's sort of expanding towards teachers, right? And so we all have a stake in this, right? It's not just the children themselves, but also teachers who are experiencing trauma. They bring it home, affects their family, right? And so it's the sort of thing that kind of affects everybody, right? So we think about trauma, right? It doesn't just happen within the individual, but we also think about it as systems affecting teachers and schools and the community. They all affect each other. Okay, so just kind of think about this idea about trauma responsive interventions or education. How many have heard of this term, trauma responsive? Yeah. Okay. So I think all of us have heard it, and sort of it kind of goes one ear out the other. We sort of like see it, and maybe kind of have an idea, but then maybe there's some misperceptions of what it is, right? And so when we talk about trauma responsive, right, it's really this idea about understanding the impact of trauma on students, incorporates this awareness on our teaching approaches to create a safe and supportive learning environment, right? So what does this mean, right? As far as being trauma responsive, right, it's being more aware of it, right? And I think, kind of just dispel two major beliefs, right? So number one, right, does that mean that as a teacher, I have to like call child services or have to be involved with the family, I have to like go out of my way to like make sure everything's okay at home, and I have to like, have to spend, constant time with the student, right? No, right? As a teacher, right, I know you have certain, responsibilities, right? And that seems to be something that teachers feel constantly overwhelmed. It's like, I have so much on my plate, right? I don't have the time to just like start calling home and connecting with the students, like, and making sure their well-being is okay, right? That's kind of not what it means. And the other part of it is, does that mean that that I have to kind of let things happen, right? Do I just let the student kind of throw chairs, yell at other kids, or it's okay to kick that other kid's, the shin, or cause like physical damage as a teacher, right? Am I supposed to just kind of stand there and not do anything about it, right? No, right? That definitely not, right? That's not what we're saying, right? And so that doesn't mean that you're a doormat. You just kind of let things happen, right? And that seems to be sort of the misconception about trauma, right? So we'll talk more about how we can become more aware, right? And understanding that what we're talking about here, right, is not a one size fits all, right? Students are individually different, right? But we can sort of at least get to the place of becoming more aware about trauma, know what it is, right? And how we just kind of slight shifts in our practices, right, can make a really big difference in how we can address this, right? So my job is not to put more work on your plate, right? My job is to take away less, right? So take a lot less, because you heard that phrase, less is more, right? And that's kind of what I want to focus on. So I'll talk a little bit about just some ideas, some paradigm shifts in trauma responsive. I would say that when we kind of learn about trauma initially, right, it's from a very kind of biomedical perspective, right? And I think I kind of broached at this earlier, how when we think about trauma, right, and we think about students' behavior. So if something happens at home and students start to act out, right? Oh, I don't want to do this, or be quiet, or they start to yell stuff, right? We sort of think about their behavior in sort of an isolated incident, right? Oh, this is volitional, this is malicious, right? The kid is acting up, right? And so it must be the kid who is, making that choice, right? Making that decision, right? Versus, we need to kind of see trauma in this kind of broader ecosystem, right? A student acts up, the teacher starts to like feel a little bit kind of like shocked. They're kind of like trying to like find out what can I do with that child, right? They get a little bit agitated, right? And that sort of kind of rattles the students, right? And they start to kind of go back and forth, right? And so when we think about trauma, right, it used to be from a very kind of biomedical perspective, from a diagnosis. Oh, that kid has this specific trauma, this kind of behavioral, right? Without kind of seeing this as sort of a whole systems issue, right? Maybe this is a product of their environment, their school, right? Things are happening in the neighborhood, right? Versus just the kid themselves, right? So we'll talk about these different levels, right? What this all kind of means. And so I would say the shift, right? The shift that we really want to focus on. I don't know if you've seen this, but when we think about this idea about when we approach a student, right? Like, oh, I don't want to eat my vegetables. I don't want to do my homework, right? Or I don't want to go outside and play, right? The first intuition is, what is wrong with you, right? What are you thinking, right? Was that the right choice, right? What were you thinking, right? We sort of have this idea, what is wrong with you? Versus what happened to you, right? There's a book, this trauma book called What Happened to You, right? That's the title of it, right? Because when we think about the child, right, we sort of kind of characterize them as a behavior, right? That's the problem child because that child had this behavior, right? So what's wrong with you, right? Versus trying to figure out, are you okay? What happened to you, right? Did something happen, with you? Like, tell me more about it, right? And so I think this is kind of where we can really kind of shift our thinking, right? And we'll kind of go into the nitty-gritties about behavior and how we can really kind of broaden our focus and not just look at behavior, but look at the underlying components to that. Okay, let me kind of skip this. I'll just kind of quickly go over this. Just as far as, again, I think I've kind of talked a little bit about just the impact of trauma, but if you really want to just, study the kind of long-term impact of trauma, they've done a lot of great studies, right, to really understand kind of what we call the longitudinal impact of trauma. So we're talking about people maybe experience trauma from age 3, right? And so when they track these adults, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, right? again, they see the accumulation of trauma, how that impacted them as adults. So it's interesting to kind of see that, they surveyed over 17,000 adults. And so for those who had trauma at a very young age, right, there's been very major impacts on all different levels, from academic, from social, right, to their careers, right. There's been a lot of different impacts, right, even kind of shortening their lifespan to a certain degree, right. And so when we think about childhood experiences, right, it's kind of multiplies and kind of affects all these different levels from, their neurodevelopment to social cognitive health risks, right, disease, right. And so, here's some quick statistic, right, even not just mentally, but also physically, right, that childhood trauma, right, has impacted them at these different ages, right. So again, kind of to that level. I want to pass this out too because I think this is like really helpful. So want to pass this out? Okay, give everybody a piece of paper. Okay. So what I'm going to show here is a new kind of way to kind of think about kind of behaviors in the classroom, right? I know, when we think about behaviors, right? Why are we so focused on behavior, right? I know, we want to focus on academics. We want to teach about compound sentences and adjectives, right? But if a student is not kind of complying or they're not following the rules or they start to jump up and down, right? That's kind of why we have to kind of focus on behavior, right? And so I like this kind of metaphor, right? You can kind of see here the picture of an iceberg, right? So think about a behavior, right? And you can kind of insert XYZ, any kind of behavior, right? From raising their hands to talking to the teacher, right? Or they start chattering with their friend next to them, or they throw the chair to the ground, or your kid throws a remote on the ground, right? Insert any kind of behavior, right? And so when we think about behavior, right, that's just at the tip of the iceberg, right? That 10%, right? But if we really kind of break it down, right, we have to kind of view that behavior as sort of a sign, right? It's not a behavior where it's like a volition, like a kid is acting on that behalf, right? We sort of have to think of that behavior as sort of a sign, right? A symptom of something bigger that's going on, right? And so, we can look at individual differences, physical body sensations, feelings, thoughts, and ideas, right? So it's really not just the behavior that is sort of like what's going on with that child, right? It's really all things underneath, right? And we'll kind of look at this and kind of unpack that. I'll kind of just kind of briefly go over this, and so there's an interesting theory called polyvagal theory. So everyone say that, polyvagal theory. It's a polyvagal, right? Big word, right? So when you woke up this morning, how many of you thought I'm gonna learn the word polyvagal or use it in a sentence, right? And this was developed by Dr. Stephen Porges, right? And so his kind of theory, right, was focused on kind of this idea about how we manifest our behaviors, right? Really the connection between brain and body, right? And so when we think about sort of a very cognitive perspective on learning and behavioral, right? We always kind of take it from a very kind of like thinking perspective, right? It must be all just kind of happens in the brain, right? Oh, what were we thinking, right? What were we thinking at that time, right? Versus kind of taking a whole picture, right? That when kids are developing, right, they haven't really quite formed, right, what we call kind of the top-down, the upstairs brain of their thinking, right, the executive control function, the prefrontal cortex, right. A lot of stuff happens in their nervous system, right. And we'll talk a little bit about just how those things, right, kind of are still being, when kids react and when they have behaviors, right, thinking of them more in terms of as a stress response, right. They're adapting to their environment, right. When thinking about why they did something, why did they throw the remote, or why is that kid tapping their table, right, or talking to the friend next to them, right? Why are they doing that, right? We sort of have to think about they are looking at their environment and trying to adapt to it, right? Versus like, oh, I'm doing this on purpose. I'm doing this to annoy the teacher. I'm doing this because I want to achieve something, right? Versus thinking about them kind of like, yeah, I am in this environment. I'm kind of using my senses, right, kind of absorbing, soaking in what's happening to me, right? If the classroom is like too loud, right, there's a lot of noise, the teacher's talking, right? As a child, right, they might be in fight or flight mode, right? I might feel a little bit unsafe, right? I'm not sure, I don't know what's going to happen, right? And so really the reality of it is that we have to kind of think about it in terms of, yeah, kids are soaking kind of information in as they go, right? But, do they have that top down? Can they, use their kind of executive plan, coordination, right, to think through things, right, to be able to regulate their emotions, right? That part is still in that process. So I'll kind of break this down a little bit. And so just, what's interesting about if you kind of do like neuroscience, I kind of bring this with my students, is that because we have so much more, research and information through neuro research, when people kind of look into the brain and they've done a lot of MRI studies, right, to kind of study the brain, right? There's more kind of insight, right, that we can gain in having a better understanding about children, right? And so, when we think about babies, right, for the most part, they're just kind of more operating from the bottom up, right? Their nervous system, right? When they're and the nervous system, right, is kind of a system based on our sort of subconsciousness, right? Our automatic kind of from breathing to regulating our emotions, right? When we experience something, right? Those things kind of happen kind of in real time, right? But when you think about the top down, the executive control function, right? The upstairs part of their brain, right? That ability for you, right? When you experience some kind of stress, right? You have the ability to kind of calm yourself, right? Like, I'm going to sit down and breathe, or I'm going to talk to a friend, right? You can sort of, harness that emotion, right? But when you think about kids, right? They're just not at that level, right? They haven't fully developed that top down, thinking, right? Everything is very bottom up, right? Whatever happens, right? It's just kind of processed through, right? But I don't have, quite the regulation to kind of calm my emotions, label it, right? It just kind of it just kind of, it just kind of happens, right? And so when we think about, the brain development, right? Especially when we think about in the context of trauma, right? Yes, they are responding to their environment, stress, right? But because, they may be in an unsafe environment, right? Some of those abilities to develop their top-down thinking, right, gets compromised, right? They haven't really formally developed, especially when you think about, if a kid who is in a very unsafe environment, very unstable, right? They don't have that, like, person there to kind of coach them through, like, how do you calm or how do you self-regulate emotions, right? So just kind of think about, every kid is kind of different, but when you think about this kind of neurodevelopment, right? It's interesting. I think about, again, this idea that most kids, right, are kind of operating from a bottom up, right? That perspective, nervous system, right? They kind of just kind of process information, and they're still forming that top down, right? You have to keep that in mind. So when you think about behavior, right? Is it intentional, right? Is the kid doing it on purpose? Is the kid trying to annoy me, or is it more that they're adapting to their environment, right? When something happens, right? Are they trying to change their environment, right? So we'll look at some different examples there. And so, let me show you. And so we think about, this kind of polyvagal theory, right? I like this kind of model because it kind of shows how the nervous system kind of reacts in different ways, right? And you can kind of simplify in these kind of red zones, blue zones, and green zones. And so what's nice about this is it's not so much for the kids that, I try to, I try to teach this to people. It's more about the adults, right? Kind of learning the signs, right? And we can kind of categorize these, right? And so we think about, the blue area, right? Kind of, if you can see that one page about that little child there. Sorry, in that little packet, I know it's kind of out of order. But if you see the kid who is in kind of the blue zone, right? The kid here is kind of on shutdown mode, right? And so in this kind of scenario, right? Maybe there's, we think about like the weather outside. It was kind of rainy outside, right? And so for all of you who are like teachers, right? If it's like a rainy day outside, what ends up happening? Okay, we have to sit in the classroom. We're just gonna, watch, Cat in the Hat on TV, right? We can't really go outside, go to the playground, go to recess, right? Go play outside, right? So when those kids are not able to go outside, what happens, right? They get kind of pent up, right? There's not a lot of like stimulation, or they're not able to go outside, right? And so maybe kids are very tired. Maybe kids are very unmotivated, right? Because they didn't have time to go outside, right? So when we think about how we kind of respond to our environment. We have kind of what's the shutdown mode. Maybe kids feel very kind of quiet. They're not really talking, right? They're sort of like trying to kind of budget their kind of energy, right? And so we kind of see that shutdown mode, right? Fight or flight, right? I think we all kind of know what that looks like, right? When kids, especially when kids view a time as being unsafe, right? And so maybe in the classroom, right, it doesn't feel necessarily unsafe, right? Maybe you're just doing this activity where you just have group projects with students, right? It's sort of a very kind of innocuous kind of thing, right? But if a kid has had some trauma at home, maybe it was like very chaotic, right? That kind of time when you like switch to let's do a group project, right? They might start feeling it's unsafe, right? They start to act up, right? Because it starts to trigger something that for them, right? They sort of become in fight or flight mode, right? So it's interesting that kind of depending on where the kid is in the context, right? kids can, fight or flight in appropriate moments, but also in moments where, in the classroom you're just doing something very simple, you just have them run outside, and suddenly a kid starts to freak out, right? Well, that fight or flight mode, just kicked in, and that could be due to, perceiving that environment is unsafe, and that's why I'm starting to act out. And so that's kind of where, as a teacher, right, how do we kind of address that? And then the last one is social engagement. So student is, for the most part, craving that social interaction, right? They really want to engage, right? They want to talk. They're very open. They want to talk to their friends. So this is kind of the place where we want to get to, right? But a lot of things have to kind of be met, right, before they get to that place where they do feel safe. They do feel like I can be open. I can share what I want to share, right? And so that's kind of, you can see that picture of like kind of those different examples of a kid who is in the green zone, right? Being just, wanting that social interaction, right? And so I'd say that, when we talked about like learning, this whole process of learning, right? I would say it's a very kind of social process, right? We think about learning, what motivates kids, right? It's, they want to feel belong, right? They want to connect, right? Even if it's like just for the sake of they love math and they want to show that they want to do well in math, maybe it's because they want to, impact society. They want to be a scientist, right? There's always kind of a social kind of lens to it, right? Especially when you think about social media. Why are people so into social media? Because it's social, right? It's because it's not so much the technology, right? It's because it's very social, right? And as people, right, we're really drawn to sort of getting our social needs met. Okay, and so the thing I really want to emphasize, right, is trauma is a sensory experience of what happens to the brain and memory during trauma. Again, to kind of highlight, again, that nervous system, right? We think about our kids, just the whole brain and body connection, right? And how everything is kind of filtered through their senses, right? Olivia, like yesterday, asked me, like, hey, what are the 5 senses? Remember you learned that in school? Remember 5 senses?
Yeah.
What is it?
Hearing, smelling, sight, taste, and smell.
Yeah, good. Yeah, so that's 5 senses, right? And so, again, when we think about schools and just think about, we really kind of look at it as kind of more about, are you, just thinking about something, right? Versus like we process our kind of experience through sensors, right? And so there's kind of 3 kind of scenarios that I want to kind of bring to your attention, right? Just how, we can kind of use this kind of framework, right, to kind of see children in different ways, right? So sensory overload or over responsivity, right? Children who are over responsive tend to respond to too much, too soon for to sensory stimuli that other children tolerate easy, right? And so I would say this, trying to use an example. So we think about, say, in a classroom, right? You have a student, right? And the teacher is, engaging with the students, right? They're doing a lesson, right? And so there's like a little girl, right, who's sitting in her table, right, and she starts to maybe start tapping really loud, right? She's kind of making this very kind of loud sound, right? And so the teacher starts to get annoyed and start to tell the student, like, hey, can you stop tapping your pencil, right? And the other classmates are kind of saying the same thing, right? And so why is she making that sound? Like, why is she tapping her pencil, right? Or why is she maybe talking louder, right? And so we kind of think of it as a way that maybe some students in the classroom, right, there's too much going on, right? And so because there's so much, noise from the teacher and maybe from the classmates, right, what's driving her to create this sound or start humming to herself or start talking to herself, right? And so maybe for the child, right, maybe they are kind of, they're feeling like there's too much, different kind of too much things going on outside their control, right? So maybe that tapping, right, is sort of an adaptation. Like I need to find a way for me to kind of help control my environment, right? There's too much things going on, right? And so the teacher, right, when they look at the student tapping, right, or kind of talking to themselves, and it's kind of annoying for the teacher, right? The teacher might perceive it as being, oh, you're being disruptive, you're making too much sound, right? Versus from a different lens, like maybe for the student, right, they feel like there's too much noise going on, right? So I need to do something to help control my environment, right? So, and sometimes students may feel a little bit too overstimulation. There's too much stimuli, right? And so that behavior, right, of trying to, create extra sound or talking to themselves or talking to the neighbor, right, might be a product of trying to kind of control their environment. Okay, so on the flip side, right, we might have students who are under responsive, right? Just kind of the blue zone where they kind of respond less or they're kind of slow, right? So when you ask a child, can you do this or can you come to a circle, right? They may just not respond, right? They may be kind of out of it, right? So if you think about an example, right? I'm trying to think of back in the days when I was like with my students, right? We're outside in the playground, right? I just remember this little girl. She's just running around, right? She loves kind of running around, being very active, right? And she starts to like bump into kids, and so like could run into another child, or she like kind of slammed her face right into the pole, right? And so why did she do that, right? I think at that time, right, she was kind of unaware of her body, right? She was sort of like flapping around, right? And so she had like little, she's kind of skinned her knee, right, here and there, right? And so we're talking to the parents about, okay, what can we do, right? She's like, she loves to run around, but she just doesn't seem to really know kind of her boundary, right? She's kind of running to things, right? And so, as I talked to her parents, we kind of realized, right, that for her, right, she's, even though, she's a little bit unaware because she's just kind of under responsive, right? She's not noticing certain things, right? So we did some kind of therapy to kind of help her adjust her bodies. We tried to, try to integrate a little bit more playtime in different areas, right? So, when kids are kind of, again, when they start to not kind of realize their limits, right? They might be a little bit under responsive and need to like find ways to kind of get that sensory experience. And so, some kids might be just feel a little bit shut down and quiet. And so some is in the classroom too. We talk a lot about behavior, seeing things that are very explicit, like not doing something, but even kids when they're not saying something or they're not responding, right? That could be a behavior that we sort of need to kind of notice more, address, right? Talk to us about why they're not actively engaging, right? And the last one is students who are really craving stimulation, like they're really craving for stimuli, right? And so, to use kind of example, we can imagine a kid who is maybe you remember the one kid, right, who loves to climb trees and jump up and down, right? Gets very active, right? They want to like run around. Sometimes in front of the parking lot, right? It's not a good thing, right? But those kids might be just very kind of very excited, right? They want to jump up and down, right? And so for those kids, what can I do, right? If they're constantly seeking stimuli, they constantly need to to fulfill their needs. Like, what can we do, right? So I remember a student, right, who had this urge to always climb up on everything, the desk, the chair, the tree, right? And so just talking to parents, what can we do to kind of fulfill that, right? And so we just kind of help that kid kind of develop kind of more calming, just kind of learning meditation, right? Learning to kind of like focus, right? And not having to jump up and down all the time. And so that kind of helped regulate his emotions, right? So for the kids who, again, are very kind of overly sensory seekers, right? Maybe we need to find ways to sort of help them kind of bring them back into the moment, right? And so, I mean, that's like one kind of strategy, but there's a lot of different strategies we can use for those students. Okay, I wanted just to take a quick pause before I kind of jump into more about teachers and more practical strategies. But I know I have kind of a lot of different questions here, but just kind of thinking first about kind of the information, if there's something, if anybody wants to respond to that, or maybe just kind of thinking of the next one, right? So looking at polyvagal theory and just looking at this whole brain-body connection, right? Has this kind of changed the way you see youth, or maybe you've seen something in your place or school? Have you seen something very similar? Can you maybe think of and just kind of think about trauma in general in this big picture, right? How do you kind of see that affecting youth? Anyone just want to share on insights on that? Mm-hmm.
I have a question. Well,
Yeah.
I really liked how you brought the trauma to the society, because I think we're just seeing so much of these behaviors in our classrooms that are not just individual students, but generally kids now. I mean, I was visiting a classroom just the other day, and a special education teacher told me what used to be mild severe is now, I mean, let me say it that way. The general education classroom, traditional classroom, is now more like mild to moderate special education classroom, because so many kids have both IEP disabilities, but also just behaviors that make it harder for teachers to do in traditional ways. So every teacher is having to adapt to this. But one of the questions I have for you is, when you think about that top-down, bottom-up kind of way of regulating self, I know we're teaching kids these skills. Teachers are asking, like, where are you today? Yellow, green, red. How are you feeling? We're observing as adults and trying to regulate the environment or respond to what the kids need. But like, what are expectations of kids also doing that? At what age are they actually able to? Because if we say to a kid, oh, you're in this zone, you should regulate yourself, like, are they even capable at 5, at 8, at 10, at 13? to make those choices, or is their brain not there yet?
Mm-hmm.
And like, how do we teach them, but also not expect them to be little adults in that?
Yeah, that's a great job. And I'd love to open it up to the room if anybody want to share insights in your classrooms, if just, you're working with young children or a little bit older, right? Where have you seen that shift of being able to cognitively, right, self-regulate, right, be able to regulate their emotions, right? Anybody want to share something? Yeah.
Well, I love this visual with the iceberg. So I work with like 4th grade, 12th grade students, and a couple workshops I give, one on stress management, one's on conflict resolution skills, and I bring in the brain, simplify like how the brain works during these experiences. And I find that even 4th graders are explaining, this stuff is part of under stress, this part of your brain isn't working, or when you're in middle school students saying this part of your brain's not keeping up. That even 4th graders, giving them the tools and the language to be able to say, like, okay, your prefrontal cortex, if you're under stress, you're experiencing trauma, being aware of how your body's responding. And I find that even with really young kids, 4th grade, that they're able to start to recognize, when you said, like, what happened to you, that it's not me, it's how I'm behaving or how my body's reacting. So, an example I give with middle school students is, have you ever studied for a test? And you say, so did you know? And I've gotten so like this, and that you have high test anxiety, that you sit down and you can't remember it. Well, you can't remember it because this part of your brain is not working. The stress part of your brain is. Well, knowing that, what can we do? So I answer one question. I find like with 4th graders, and definitely middle school students, that more we can equip them with those aha moments of, oh, I'm acting like this, what's going on? That's fine.
Yeah.
I think it's different for every single student. And some students are, I'm a counselor at K-12 here in Santa Ana. And specifically with students who are on the spectrum, we see students who do adapt well to the regular green environment meeting, but it is more bottom up. And I think just through consistency and that miles on, I haven't heard that yet, that every class is not that, and that's actually true. I agree with that statement. It's training our teachers and with interventions that are trial and error through consistency and time, we have seen improvement in students who we said, oh, this isn't going to work at all. And you just got to stick with it and a few week process, 3 weeks, 4 weeks, reassess, come back, SST, go again. But something I like to remember is they're 6 years old. They're still 5 years old, and their mind is everywhere and still growing. And it's very, very different for every single student that I've ever encountered. It's not a cookie cutter, and developmentally, I think it's very hard to pinpoint exactly what works with who and at what age. It's just trial and error, and that's, I think, difficult for the teachers that I'm working with to grasp. They want a quick fix. They want to get to the lesson, and I think by being proactive in some of the interventions or setting the correct environment, in the long run, you'll be more effective in the classroom in teaching those students and setting up the correct environment. But I see it different for every single student.
To add to that, so I'm an occupational therapist working with like pre-K all the way to 12th grade special education. And a lot of it depends on the students' cognitive levels too, right? And it can look differently, like you said, for each student. But what helps even with the younger students, like even kindergartners, is just helping them be aware of how their body is feeling, giving them language around that, right? Like, oh, I feel wiggly right now. And then options that you trial and error to see what their body responds to it. Do you need like a break, a movement break, a fidget, like a deep squeeze? And just there's a lot of different tools and combinations out there that like one strategy I like to use is presenting a visual icons of different tools, right? And you kind of just let the kid kind of choose one. provide that, see how his body responds, and trial and error that way, see if, the child can be more regulated throughout the school day.
I think that just as a grandparent who sometimes has a kinship care situation with my grandkids, their parents aren't necessarily always there. And I watched my 6-year-old grandson start to just flip out. And his older sister, 4th grade, she says to him, "Kian, take a deep breath." And then she said, "Let's count." So somebody at school is teaching them this. They aren't getting this at home. And they counted to 5 together, and then they were able to talk about what he was freaking out about. And so he's only 6, but it was interesting to see her help him through that moment, which is something that trauma siblings do, help each other. But it's good to see the tools. Somebody is doing a good job giving them tools, so thank you to all of you who are doing that.
Yeah, I love all these ideas. I think as myself, as an educator, this was the area that I really struggled in because as someone who just started teaching, right, they only teach you, charts, behavioral charts, gold stars, right? They give behavior in a very linear way, right? Words and consequences, right? Negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, right? And that should do the trick, right? That's going to change behavior, right? In reality, right? It's that bottom up, right? Where the things they're doing are kind of learned behavior because of the product environment, right? And so I think because we think behavior in a very, very linear way, we expect things to happen, this is the way it should go. And I think, this is the things you're mentioning about the different strategies, right? The breaks, the mental breaks and the fidgets, right? I think those are, definitely kind of more concrete things that we can use in the classroom. But I think in teacher education program, I see it all the time where, there's just not enough focus on this. Like we just stick to the, the bread and butters of, here's your lesson plan, here's, here's this theory, right? And using this system, right? And it just doesn't align with the realities that we see in the classroom. So it's sort of, any other, I don't know, just kind of getting into this, anyone want to share?
This is more just a real world experience.
Yeah.
I don't have experience in the classroom, but my friend who's an educator, she has a 2-year-old son, and when he needs a break or is throwing a tantrum, she won't just say breathe, she'll say, smell the roses, blow out the candles, smell the roses, blow out the candles. And so I've never seen that before, and I just thought that was a good tool, even if he doesn't understand the meaning behind, like he needs to take deep breaths, but just like going through that motion. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah.
It helped a little bit, but I mean, it's so.
Yeah.
Actually, perspective as a student,
Yeah.
we didn't have that like a teacher didn't have. In middle school, I was going through a lot, and I went to a charter school, so it was a very different curriculum. But we had like a home group. I was like most of the day we were there, and my home group teacher, it was Miss Saldana, and she was amazing to me. I was struggling with sleeping at home, and I wasn't struggling with undiagnosed mental problems, and in her class, I would struggle to stay still, I would struggle to focus and be able to do anything, so she provided me with fidget toys that I didn't even know I needed, but she would give me them, or she'd let me walk around her back in her class, or when I would come in and she would see how exhausted I was, she'd take me outside and say, hey, what's going on? Can we talk? And I would tell her what was going on because I didn't have a single go at home. And then she would let me take naps in her class. When she knew I had work done, she said, you can just sleep, just rest. And she ended up actually going with me. I went then to a private school for high school, and she actually joined me at that private school. She became a teacher there, so I was with her for a long time. But like sometimes having that teacher, like having her there for me was like, it could have been like life or death. Like she was incredible as a resource in my life. So like teachers, it does make a huge impact.
Any other thoughts?
I work for a foundation called J3. We teach 4th graders to read, copy, and stuff like that. And so we do a lot of social and emotional learning and restorative practices with the kids and everything. And it really helps. Plus, it's, like 15, 20 kids. So we're able to sit there. We have more adults, and we're like 4 to 5 adults. So it's like 1 adult to 5 kids. So we're able to really help them a lot. When kids have a bad day in the club, there's always going to be an adult being able to sit there and take them aside and spend a lot of time with them. So I think we do self-awareness and self-management and all these different skills to try to help them as well as trying to get their reading skills.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you brought that up because we'll kind of move on to the next one because I do want to talk a little bit about teachers themselves and we can kind of collaborate, right? As a teacher, right? How do I get the strategy, but just for myself, like get nourished and be able to kind of provide, do my own self care and be trauma responsive. So again, I think when we think about the life of a teacher, right, working with 30 students at a time, right? So very soon, theoretically, if he has trauma, right, that kind of passes to the students, passes to the teacher, right? And so again, this is a trend that I see with a lot of first-year teachers, especially when they're starting teachers, just how very tired they are, very burnt out, right? They're lacking energy, right? And so it makes sense, right? Because you're in a profession where you're giving a lot, right? You're giving, right? It's a lot of empathy, right? So as a teacher, right, it's kind of you're burning at both ends of the candle, right? How do I, as a teacher, get nourished, right? It's all the different things does influence as far as, and they bring that home, sleeplessness, and isolation, right? And so, how does that help me, right, as a teacher, right? If I'm trying to address trauma, right, but for myself, right, I'm also experiencing this burnout, right? And so, I just kind of leave it just some practical things to kind of think about. And I think when we think about trauma, I think if there's one, kind of key things to kind of take away: safety, collaboration, voice and choice, trustworthiness, peer support, and cultural, historical, gender issues. And all these different things about like safety. When I think about like this idea about like trauma, because thinking about what is like the trigger of trauma, and it's just when students are in an environment, right, where there's no structure, right, they're at home, or there's it feels unsafe, right? And so as a teacher, we can sort of try to build that into the classroom, right? Consistency, stability, right? Kind of minimizing kind of transitions, right? And that kind of gives students just a little bit more of an expectation that doesn't trigger some fight or flight because they're thinking about what's going on at home. In collaboration with families, and I think that kind of goes without saying that how we can promote that with our teachers or with our families. And then, and just the way we, and I think with teachers themselves, right? If a student is like very agitated, right? It doesn't help when the teacher or you or the teacher, right, are feeling agitated, right? Like you're not in that place, right? And so something that we can do is how do we sort of be able to calm ourselves, right, before we approach that situation? Because in that time when we're not calm, right, that just further agitates that student, right? So even for teachers, right, we have to find times to kind of take a step back and find places where we can rest and recover, right? We don't have to like go out and try to put out every single fire, right? But it only benefits the teacher if we're in a place, right, to connect with that students, right? And it kind of goes to this term co-regulation, where there's this whole beautiful thing where the students, their emotion is very kind of in sync with the parent or the caregiver or the teacher, right? And so when they're both in sync, right, then they can kind of accomplish that kind of co-regulation. But for the teacher themselves, like you can't do this when you're also kind of on high stress level, right? We sort of have to find ways to kind of modulate that. Okay. So I know kind of time is kind of running down, but just anything as far as just talking about trauma responsive services. I mean, I'd love to kind of hear about kind of best practices going on in your school, something that we can kind of, because I think all of you, can share better than I can, but I just want to learn more about just your own personal, professional experiences that you've found that was really helpful for teachers. It's something that we can kind of share amongst the group.
We actually had a student free day yesterday. I missed the morning for our teachers to work through these steps with specific students and behaviors or situations in their classroom for co-regulating with students. Some of our students cannot yet self-regulate in certain situations or classroom, and it's really a time for self-reflection, I think, for some teachers as well, to work on their own strategies and skills that they have in the class to better support their students. That's very hard. It's very hard to do and say, I need to change, I need to make some changes. What I'm doing is not working. And that's okay. And so we are trying to normalize that and working step by step with students, because in the books that you read, it says, use coping strategies, but there is no concrete list of coping strategies of A equals B or B equals C. It's whack-a-mole, and it's trying different things at different times, and what works this week will not work next week. So we gave a space for teachers to share their frustrations, and it is difficult for them to self-regulate at times, and to be in charge of 30 students where it's 2 students who are taking over the entire class, and how do I take care of 28 when I really need to focus on this? So I think just giving that space for teachers to share their stressors and that we support each other and that admin supports them as well. And gathering information in books like this to take to them as well is huge. Just having those conversations, because I don't feel there's enough conversations around this at all, especially in teachers programs. From what I've heard, I haven't done a teacher program, only counseling, but there's not enough. So.
Yeah, that's a great topic because I want to just kind of bring that up. Do you feel that your supervisor, your admin are supportive? Because I think it sort of can happen, right? If there's a buy-in from the administration, right? It's very hard to kind of do this work without your school and just kind of want to learn more about. Do you feel like this is something that on their radar? Is it something on their priority? Do you feel like, obviously we could do more to kind of promote it, but just, currently right now, how do you feel as far as just the awareness level or support for this kind of work, kind of from the ground level? Yeah. Yeah.
I'm a teacher on special assignment, and I pretty much support all the TK schools in our district, and we're pretty big, we're in our growth. As we have 60 plus schools. I do take care of our preschool and then all the way to 12th grade. But a lot of them say we want more, we need more support, like an extra quality, especially with our SCAD students, our students going back to the classroom, to the gen ed schools. They really want that support system in place. And I specifically went out this past week to a preschool that has predominantly special education, and we have a lot of services being provided to the students, and they're just burnt out. And they're burnt out since COVID, and they would talk to me about this pandemic really hit me hard with Zooming, just made me more migraines, and I can't handle screen time anymore. And so they will actually bring the iPads in with the students, right? And so this became an issue. Okay, I know that we have technology and everyone's one-to-one now, but they wouldn't be able to implement that for the students. And so it's kind of like a disadvantage, right? Because you have it, but you're not using it. Mm-hmm. At the same time, the concern for the teachers and their mental sanity and the emotional support. And I've seen it from schools that have big clusters and combo classes that are really academically driven. And they're telling me oh my gosh, I have the COVID babies right now. Right. And they missed out on the years of school. And it was just really hard because they're jumping all over. It's just really hard to put out those fires. Yes, SST does help. Does help to have RSP, all the IBIs and all that acronyms that we have. Yeah. It's just it's so concerning for them because they're we need to get them ready for next year. It's already getting ready to closing out the year, and they're just already checked out. They're like, Margaret, I just have to be honest with you. It's not even January, and at the beginning of January, and they're like, I'm already checked out. And they're like, we have testing coming up. It's coming up in is it March or April, right? The SMAC and everything, and the science testing is coming back, and so they're like, how to get them released. Yeah. But even so, I'm a mom as well, and I have about 2-year-old, and even though I've done all this, been a teacher for so many years, and I've been a teacher, TOSA, I'm like, oh, I should, my husband's like, you should know this very well, how to handle her, but I can't handle her. Yeah. So, it's heartening. I personally witnessed her go through a traumatic event. She actually had a seizure. She fell, had a concussion, ended up with 2 seizures, and trying to cope with that. But nowhere in the parent handbook does it tell you, be prepared for this. So there won't be a specific recipe or a specific handbook telling you, this is what you need to prepare for, this is what you need to do, because every situation is different. But yes, there needs to be a push for it. The gen ed teachers are more people. But then also we're thinking about the financial, the budgeting. Right? We hear that the budgeting, there's going to be some cuts coming up. Right? ELO, if you're familiar with that, right? So we have that funding available right now just to help extended learning opportunities. But when will that fund finish? And when it does, what will happen? Because there are some students who do need support, and a lot of our families, because of where we're at, they're always asking for parenting helps. What can we do? Because they're struggling too at home.
Yeah.
And oftentimes the answer for any problem they have at home is, here, I'm gonna give you my phone, here, I'm gonna give you my iPad, here, I'm gonna give you my laptop, my TV. But there's that disconnect. Right?
Yeah.
How are you gonna connect,
Yeah. Yeah, and I appreciate all of you being here and sharing that. I think about like trauma, I always kind of think about it as sort of this kind of dark cloud looming, right? It's kind of a moving target, right? I don't know. It makes me think about the presidential election coming up. It's like, yeah, we know it's coming, but we just want to avoid it. But we just want to let it happen, and then we'll deal with the rest. But with that said, right, what happened during COVID, right? We sort of adjusted, right? We pivoted, right? And we're able to kind of tackle it along, right? And so now it's not really an issue anymore. Now the CDC says you don't have to spend 5 days at home anymore. Like we seem to kind of turn the corner, right? But when pandemic COVID happened, right, we sort of like weren't sure what to do about it. But I think there can be solutions, and I just want to be optimistic. Yeah, if we can handle COVID, right, then trauma could be the next step we could try to tackle on. So I really appreciate you all being here. I know my time is up, so if you want to talk with me, I'll be available for a couple minutes. But really appreciate you all being here on a weekend. So thank you so much.